Welcome. We gather to have conversations, and have conversations because that's one of the best gifts in our human existence. To be able to talk to one another and to share stories, and particularly to share stories around our life and what it means for us in terms of the sense of what's important in life. And so it is a great honor to have Gary Margolis, who is has official title. And can you tell us what that is?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to say that I live in Cornwall, and that a few years ago I was asked to be Cornwall Town Poet.
What a great title!
Yeah.
What a great title! And you. You've worked at the college,
Yep.
And tell us a little bit about that experience.
I worked at the college for many years as a counselor, as well as occasionally teaching poetry writing, poetry reading, as a member of the English and American Literatures Department. So that combination of listening to students, and then listening to the stories in literature and in poems, and then creating one's own. That combination of listening and creating, and going beyond the initial story, has always been a meaningful combination for me.
It's exciting to work with young people in college, I'm sure. But thinking back to the earlier days for yourself, but did you know fairly early on that you were going to be a writer or a poet or a counselor? Did any of those things come early?
I don't think I knew those things overtly or publicly. I think I knew them very privately. And what I mean by that is, so I grew up outside of Boston, where I went to school, then high school in New Hampshire, and then I was an undergraduate at Middlebury. And during those times played a number of sports, team sports. And that was in the days in the 50s and 60s when the arts for men were more quieted and private. So, you know, as one of those male team players, the fact that I was actually keeping a journal, somewhat of a diary, and writing poems privately was something that I did keep very quiet until I actually came to college here. And at one point, as the story goes, a young woman who I was spending a good deal of time with, and who was an English major, which I wasn't, kept talking about this poet on campus and how much she was learning from him. And I don't know if I kind of wanted to actually see this person who I became to feel jealous of, given how much time she was spending talking about him, or that I wanted to begin to meet my first writer. So I actually showed up at his office and kind of stood there, and he looked at me and said, "You play football, don't you?" And I said, "Yes," and had nothing more to say. And he handed me 3 poems by Frost, Wallace Stevens, and Yeats. And he said, "Gary, take these poems, and after you've read them, come back and we'll have a conversation about them." Which I did, that having been a very unique invitation. And at the end of that conversation, almost similar to what you just asked me, he looked at me and he said, "Do you write poems?" And I paused. I had never told anybody that I had. And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Bring some poems by and we'll talk about them." And that invitation, encouragement, then led to a lifelong conversation with him, and the support and curiosity to begin to read in depth, and then also to begin to write my own poems.
So that's a unique writing, teaching style. Have you found yourself following in that same kind of footstep as you work with young people?
Yeah, but that's a great question too, both as a counselor and then as a writer. When you're sitting with someone and just kind of being present, following the conversation, and beginning to have an intuition about are there unexpressed interests, curiosities, stories, and or difficulties that are there but haven't been expressed yet. So if I feel like we've established some connection and rapport, I might begin asking questions that lead to more expression, storytelling, and even the questions around. By the way, do you write? Do you write fiction? Do you write nonfiction? Do you write poetry? Or what are your arts? You know, what are your special ways of connecting with your soulfulness and with the world? So I'll let the conversation kind of develop, and then have a sense of asking these questions that I think invite more expression.
Has male reluctance to identify with poetry, has that changed much in the time since you've been?
I think that has. I think that has changed. I think there has been more sense of being able to show and demonstrate a little bit more of the breadth of who people are, without being so closely defined by certain norms or stereotypes or reluctances about letting more be visible. So I would say that that's definitely true.
And your poetry becomes known in many ways, but in our community, it's often connected to community events. Talk about why that is why you're drawn to that.
Yeah. Well, if you saw my early poems, they were wonderfully pretentious. And written in voices that I only could read in books and imitate and copy. And I think over these years, for any of us, getting comfortable with and finding one's own voice, and a voice then that also is able to communicate feeling and image and surprising connections. That's what began to happen for me over these writing years, but very, very located in the locations in which I live. So that means Cornwall, Addison County, Middlebury, Ripton, and in the details of that these places and the events, but I would also say the language that is specific to place and to our place. And one thing that would go with that has been encouraging over the years is that I don't know if you might remember this, Len, but that years ago there was I think he lived in Bridport. His name was Frank Cutler, and he sent hundreds of letters to the editor at the Addison Independent, our local newspaper.
Right. And
I thought, I wonder what will happen if I sent some poems to the Addison. And initially, they began publishing them as letters to the editor, because the sense of publishing poetry maybe 15 or 20 years ago in newspapers wasn't as established. So I considered myself proudly the Frank Cutler of letters to the editor of poetry.
That's a great title.
And then that morphed into, over these years, the Addison, and having a nice relationship with them around publishing occasional poems in that way.
You have a new book, I think.
Yes.
Could you tell us about that?
Yeah. So I'm happy to say that this new book, Runner Without a Number, has just been published in the last couple of weeks. And it's published in the Voices of Vermonter series of Windridge Publishing, which is in Vermont. And the cover photograph is a photograph from the memorial in Copley Square in Boston from the Boston Marathon. And the title, Runner Without a Number, actually refers to all of the runners that do run in the marathon that haven't qualified formally. And so they run, as they say in Boston, as Boston Bandits, which I was one 37 years ago. But it's a book that deals with these national events of grief. There are poems in there related to that, and then how we go beyond grief in our daily lives, and also in our national lives too.
Can you share some with us?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So let me read the first poem in the book, which, in relation to story, for me it's sort of how multiple stories intersect sometimes, and or multiple activities. So the title, Mall Walking the Dirt Road, kind of combines that kind of contemporary term of going to a mall and exercising or mall walking, but mall walking the dirt road. And I do start every day out on Sperry Road, taking an hour's walk. But I tried to combine the locations in this poem, and with somewhat of a sense of humor too. Mall walking the dirt road. Good morning, shopkeepers, unlocking your plate glass doors, sweeping the overnight leaves. Hello, security, moving vagrant words along. Cheers to the custodians of stones, stone by stone. The delivery men unloading their stores, their pallets of birds. Congrats to the American Redstart, calling again. Red Wing's amazing diamond in the rough, a phrase the field uses to describe itself. Dew on a haystack, a jewel in a window. This morning you can stop on the side of the road to window shop, to catch your breath, to see where the deer sleep in their emerald beds, to find feathers for your headdress, to begin walking in circles again.
I can imagine that road.
You can imagine that.
I don't know which one it is, but I can imagine that road.
Yeah, you can imagine that road here, and just this activity of paying attention, of taking things in, whether it's at a mall or the mall of the dirt road, and the sense too that the other location is the location of actually writing the poem too.
Can you share some more?
Yeah. Let me read a few more. So this poem is called What Monster? And even though I grew up near Fenway Park and the Green Monster, now our much more local monster is referenced in this poem. So we know we're talking about Champ. But the poem is called What Monster? A stranger tells you he saw it twice. Once in his lifetime, once in his afterlife. Diving and rising, a shadow of an outline on the lake. Believed some waves are real myths, outside and in. A story, a place to begin. Sitting by a lake at twilight, looking out, half believing what you're told. There are guns stored beneath a school, cannons firing inside a hold, a fish that's really a horse. Stories you have to believe you're being told, amidst the smoke and mist. You can call history's veil, that wisp from here, a glimpse of a shadow gliding across the waves, looking back to its closing wake. So you know, these lines inside of this poem. So you know, there's a speaker, someone sitting by the lake, and at least for me, I may know where a poem is beginning, or the story, the piece of the story that's beginning. But like, you know, like in almost all creative acts, you never quite know and don't want to know where it's going. You know,
so it catches you by surprise.
Catches you by surprise, and then I think as a writer, or as say a reader, when you are caught by surprise, I think then you have to decide. Do I want to keep that surprise there? Is that surprise going to keep revealing more, or not? And so you know, some of these lines in this poem that seem curious in a particular way, half believing what you're told. There are guns stored beneath a school, cannons firing inside a hold, a fish that's really a horse. I mean, these things that are a little bit unbelievable. Except they're not quite. You know, as we know, with all the violence across the country in schools, that line, there are guns stored beneath a school. So that line came up, but then the next line, cannons firing inside a hold. So sitting by Lake Champlain simultaneously, you know, thinking of violence in schools, but simultaneous to that, then the you know the war on Lake Champlain too. So you know, poems and stories work sometimes too by association. Without spelling it all out, you put these lines next to each other, and somehow there's a feeling of connection, or the imagination begins to ponder it.
Right. Okay. In terms of teaching,
Yeah.
do you have a preferred? I want to go back to some more poems, but it just occurred to me. Do you have a preferred age to work with in terms of poetry and story? Is that the three ages? I mean, I don't have a. It's been more than one. But what has been really kind of delightful and rewarding. It goes back to your first question, which is, when did you know that you kind of were interested in writing, or wanted to be a writer, or practice writing? I think in middle school and high school, you know, young people begin to have an intuition about that, particularly if they're readers, if they've been good readers. And so being able to teach and interact with them when they're on the cusp of that sense of, I want to make words too. I want to make sentences. I want to write stories. I want to write poems. I want to write essays about things that interest me. So I think in middle school and high school, kids begin to have a beginning sense of that, or not, like, forget it, I'm not interested. And then I think it also then percolates again in late adolescence and in college age. And you don't have to go to college to have a sense of, I want to write. I have something I want to say. And lastly, over the last few years, I've been teaching at the Burlington Writers Workshop and for the Poetry Society of Vermont, teaching with older adults who then come to their writing and the craft of writing later in life. And that's great because there aren't a lot of preconceptions. Yeah. I was thinking about your story about how you started sending poems to the Addison Indy because the letters that were coming prompted that idea, and I just became mindful of how much poetry is now in the Addison Indy on a fairly frequent basis, and how a lot of it comes from young people.
Yes.
The Young Writers Project.
Yeah, the Young Writers Project, which is statewide. and which the Addison, and the Burlington Free Press reproduce. So yeah, how poetry then becomes more part of daily life is indicated in that way.
I had a chance to be a part of J-Term this year and to take the hospice training course.
Yeah.
And there's 18 young people, young adults there, and 3 of us who are community auditors. It was a great privilege to be with young people with that, dealing with those kind of issues about the end of life, but how much they were drawn to poetry in that whole process.
Right. And poetry in their, I think sometimes too, in their vernacular and in their contemporary style. So, and meaning that, yes, they can read what the traditional poems sound like in traditional forms. But now it's we're in a very active time where then music, song lyrics, freestyling and rap, I mean, just the different ways that music is made from words is quite broad, and I think it's all of one cloth, actually.
Want to read some more poems?
Sure.
It's a great thing to be able to listen to poems being read.
So let me read you. Let me read you 2 or 3 more.
Sure.
Okay. And this poem is called "My Habit," and we know sometimes kind of what we want or need to write about, and what things we would feel more reluctant to write about. Things that either we've held close to ourselves or have been secret, or quirky things about ourselves. So this poem describes one of those, but it actually, I think, hopefully invites the reader to ask that question of themselves. What are my unique habits that I thrive on, but I'm not sure I would tell anybody about? My habit. I like to save the Sunday papers and read them at the end of the year. Maybe you do too. Although neither of us have said so, each week picking up our country's times, as if we were going to sit down at home, section by section, for the better half of an afternoon. I wouldn't mind if one of us said more than we do at the checkout counter, climbing into our cars in the parking lot. Something as strange as hello, as to why we have stacks of papers in our back seats, not saving them for mulch. Although that's not a bad idea, the volunteers at our co-op more than suggest. I'd tell them on December 31st, I like to read Who's Still Married, what our world leaders month after month are leading us to. If the war was won, lost, or changed its name. Whose obituary was written 6 months ago. I like to guess what's been invented, whose reputation has been enhanced. If anyone's reading that terrific book reviewed in March to get us through this winter's breath. And the cartoons that are so funny, they last. The one, I don't know if you saw it, of a rabbit sitting on Freud's couch, telling him a year's worth of bunny dreams. I hope you find amusing. Enough so we don't have to say we save things to recycle, to help our reputation at the co-op's checkout counter. And not just so if we sit down to talk, to offer our names. Either of us would have to explain why we love to read the sports scores late. Who won their division? Which blouse was all the rage? What couch is still in fashion?
Oh, love that. That's good. That's great. That's great. The 3 poets that he gave you.
Yes.
Did those 3 poets become key poets in your life, or?
Well, I mean, Frost. Frost over the years taking many years ago, taking first-year students to the Frost Cabin,
Mm-hmm.
so they could say they'd been to the Frost Cabin,
Yeah.
and taking my classes to the Frost Cabin, and then reading Frost poetry as well as his biography. There's no way that you'd want to avoid Frost living in Addison County as a writer. And then Yeats, for all not only all of his form and music, but for the politics of Ireland in those days. So the political writing, and then some of his much more imaginative and far out poetry too, but in the forms that he was writing. And Stevens, just because, at least for me, he was so difficult. Psychologically, philosophically, in different ways. So Stevens has been a long challenge, but they were part of the conversation with that other poet,
and many others, I'm sure.
Yeah.
You've spent a lot of your life as a counselor,
Yeah.
and as a helper and a healer. Any thoughts and reflections upon stories and how they fit into that experience or those experiences?
Yeah, I think that people want to be heard. They want their story to be heard. And the parts of it that have been exciting and interesting and rewarding, and the parts of their stories that have been painful, that have indicated also how they have survived. And so there's those stories, and then the parts of the stories, the pieces of the stories that they don't totally know if they want to tell someone or not. But I think that kind of human urge to express and need to express and to be witnessed, to be recognized and heard, goes with having a story and telling a story, and being part of human endeavor. So it's personal history, but how it also then connects to our life over time on this planet.
Oh, thank you, Gary. This has been a very rich conversation, and you've taken us many places, and I really appreciate this opportunity to hear. And I know the people who watch this and who will look it up on the website in the times to come will also know that they have had an example of what it really means to love stories and to want to deal with them in a way that is beautiful and helpful and supportive in life. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And Len, love is the right word.
Love is the right word.